The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the officer doing it had no idea he was arresting the man who had spent the last 8 months building the case that was about to end his partner's career. He pressed my face against a cold concrete pillar and told me to stop resisting. I wasn't resisting. I was trying to breathe. But let me go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with handcuffs. It starts with a parking garage on 5th and Monroe, a dead key fob battery, and a white officer who saw exactly what he decided to see. My name is Marcus Webb. For 3 years before that night, I worked undercover narcotics for the Metro Police Department's Special Investigations Unit. That meant no badge on my belt, no uniform, no patrol car with a mounted radio. It meant a beat-up 2009 Honda Accord that I'd driven so long the driver's side door handle had started to stick. It meant coming home smelling like cigarette smoke and bad decisions. And it meant that the people in my building sometimes crossed the street when they saw me coming. I'd gotten used to that. What I hadn't prepared for was the night my own department tried to arrest me for standing next to my own car. That Tuesday had started like most others. I woke up at 6:15, ground my coffee beans, whole Guatemalan dark roast, a habit I picked up from my father, and stood in the kitchen of my apartment on Clement Street, watching the sky turn from black to gray. My cat, a fat tabby named Lieutenant, wound himself between my ankles demanding breakfast. I gave him the good stuff. He ate, ignored me, and went back to sleep. I envied him more than I could say. I'd been working deep cover for 8 months at that point, embedded in a distribution network linked to 3 separate overdose deaths in the West Side corridor. My contact, a man I'll call Ray, had given me access to supply routes, cash pickups, and eventually the name of the cop who was taking money to look the other way. That cop's name was Officer Dennis Harlow. He was 34, 6 years on the force, 2 commendations, and a side income that had paid for a lake house his salary had no business affording. I'd been feeding that information to my handler, Lieutenant Chen, in carefully timed bursts. By that Tuesday night, we were 3 weeks from making the arrest. 3 weeks. My cover identity was a man named Darius Cole. Darius had a record, 2 prior drug charges, 1 dismissed, 1 probated, constructed by our department's identity unit with enough paper trail to survive a background check. I wore different clothes as Darius, drove the Accord, kept my real phone locked in a safe at the precinct. Everything about Darius was carefully maintained. Everything except apparently his car's key fob battery. I discovered it was dead when I came out of the parking garage elevator at 11:30 that night after a 4-hour meeting I cannot describe in detail. I pressed the unlock button. Nothing. Pressed again. The Accord sat 20 feet away in the yellow overhead light, silent and stubborn. I dug into my jacket pocket for the physical key insert, the little blade that slides out of the fob, and walked toward the driver's side door. I heard the footsteps before I saw him. "Hey, stop right there." I stopped. The voice came with a flashlight beam that hit me directly in the eyes, and I raised my hand reflexively to shield them. That gesture, I would later learn, was the one Officer Craig Pelham described in his incident report as aggressive and threatening. The hand that was blocking a flashlight from a man's eyes. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice level and my hands visible, "I'm just trying to get into my car. The fob battery is dead. My key is right here." No. I held up the fob slowly, the physical blade extended, making sure every movement was deliberate, unhurried, visible. He was already on his radio. I stood with the key in my outstretched hand, completely still, watching him call it in. He was maybe 25, pale, the kind of face that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be nervous or certain, and had settled on an uncomfortable combination of both. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon. I noted that, filed it. but close enough to mean something. "What's your name?" he asked. I gave him the cover name. "Darius Cole." "This your vehicle, Darius?" "Yes, sir. Registered to Darius Cole. You're welcome to run the plate." He walked around the car slowly, shining the flashlight along the chassis, peering through the windows. I tracked him with my peripheral vision without turning my body. Every muscle in me wanted to pull the badge I didn't have and end this in 30 seconds. But I didn't have a badge. I had a key fob, a cover identity, and 8 months of work that would dissolve the instant I blew it. So I stood still and breathed. "Why are you in this garage at this hour?" he asked, coming back around to my side. "Came out of the building," I said, nodding toward the elevator behind me. "Had a late meeting." "What kind of meeting?" "Business." I kept my voice neutral, flat, the word that gives nothing away. He looked at me for a long moment. The flashlight moved from my hands up to my face, holding there. I knew exactly what he was doing. I had done it myself, years before when I walked a patrol beat on the south side. The assessment, the calculation, the decision tree that is supposed to be based on observable behavior, but that, in practice, sometimes runs on a different algorithm entirely. I watched him run it. I watched him arrive at his conclusion. I watched the conclusion lock into place behind his eyes like a deadbolt sliding home. "Step away from the vehicle," he said. I didn't move immediately. That was my mistake. Not a legal mistake, not a safety mistake, but a tactical one. I took one breath too long before complying, because I was furious, and my fury lived in that single breath. His hand dropped to his radio again, and his weight shifted forward. "Sir, I am not doing anything illegal," I said. "This is my car. I am unlocking it with a physical key because the battery in my fob is dead. If you run the plate—" I said, "Step away." There is a moment in certain confrontations where the air changes, where whatever thin membrane of civility had been stretched between two people simply gives way, silently, like a thread pulled too far. I felt it go. I stepped back from the car and raised my hands palms out because I knew exactly how the next 90 seconds could go, and I had no interest in becoming a statistic. Not tonight. Not 3 weeks before everything we had built was supposed to come apart at the right seams. He had his cuffs out before I finished the thought. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Officer." "Turn around." The cold of the concrete pillar against my cheekbone. The ratchet of the cuffs tightening past comfortable, past the point of courtesy. His weight shifting behind me as he searched my jacket pockets and found the key fob, my burner phone, and $43 in cash. No weapon. No drugs. No identification that would tell him anything he wasn't already certain he knew. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked my profile, his voice carrying that particular flatness that isn't neutrality, but a performance of it. I almost laughed. I had been coming to this neighborhood 4 times a week for 8 months. I knew the name of the kid who swept the bodega floor on the corner every morning. I knew which third-floor apartment Ray used for his Thursday pickups. I knew exactly where Dennis Harlow parked his personal truck when he came to collect his cut. But I said none of that. I said nothing. I breathed through my nose and stared at the yellow fluorescent buzz of the parking garage ceiling and let the silence do what it needed to do. Another squad car arrived 6 minutes later, and with it came Officer Pelham's partner, a heavyset man named Torres, who had the look of someone pulled from sleep and not happy about it. He walked over, looked at me standing cuffed against the pillar, then looked at the Accord, then back at me. "What's the situation?" he asked Pelham. "Suspicious male attempting to break into a vehicle," Pelham said. I closed my eyes, not from despair. I had passed despair somewhere around minute 2 of this, but to keep my face from showing exactly what it needed to show in that moment, because what Pelham had just said was not what had happened. What Pelham had just said was a version of events where I was already guilty. A version he had written before he'd crossed the garage toward me. A version that had nothing to do with key fobs, or dead batteries, or anything except that he had seen a black man standing next to a car and had made his calculation. And now that calculation was official. It was on the radio. It existed in the world. Torres was running the plate. I could hear the radio traffic. The registration came back clean. Darius Cole, current address, no outstanding warrants. Torres looked at the output, then looked at me, then looked at Pelham with an expression I couldn't fully read from my angle. "You want to hold him?" Torres asked. "Yeah," said Pelham. He folded his arms. "Something feels off. Something feels off. 8 months of undercover work. 3 men dead from tainted product. A dirty cop with a lake house and a clean record who was 17 days from being walked out of his precinct in handcuffs. And the thing that felt off to Officer Craig Pelham was me, standing next to my own car, holding my own key. They put me in the back of Pelham's cruiser. I sat in the plastic seat with my hands pinned behind me and stared at the scuff marks on the partition divider and told myself, very quietly, very deliberately, not to make a single call, yet, not to blow the cover, not to panic, to think, because somewhere in the chain of what was about to happen, there was a moment where this would either dissolve quietly or explode in every direction at once, and I needed to be the one who chose which. I didn't know yet that the choice had already been made for me. I didn't know that Pelham had already filed a preliminary report, and I didn't know that the name Darius Cole had just been entered into a system that Officer Dennis Harlow, the very man I was 3 weeks from arresting, had access to from his desk on the 3rd floor of the 4th District Precinct. I didn't know any of that yet. But I would. By morning, I would know all of it. The holding cell at the 4th District smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, and the particular brand of institutional hopelessness that soaks into concrete over decades. I sat on the bench with my back against the wall and my wrists finally free. They'd removed the cuffs when they booked me. And I counted the things I knew for certain. 1. My cover identity was intact. 2. The car's registration had cleared. 3. I had committed no crime. 4. Somewhere above me, on the 3rd floor of this same building, Dennis Harlow had just seen the name Darius Cole scroll across a database query screen. Whether he'd connected it to anything yet, I didn't know. That was the variable that frightened me more than the cell, more than Pelham, more than any of it. I had one permitted phone call. I used it at 1:14 in the morning, and I did not call a lawyer. I called a number I had memorized the same way you memorize a fire exit, hoping you never need it, making sure you could find it blind in the dark. It rang twice. Lieutenant Chen picked up on the 3rd ring, and I could hear immediately that she had not been sleeping. "It's me," I said. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell me she understood everything about what those 2 words meant at this hour from this number. "Where?" she said. "4th District. Held on suspicious." The plate cleared. No charges filed yet. Another pause. Then quietly and very precisely. "Did anyone on 3 run your name?" "That's what I need you to find out." She told me to sit still. I sat still. I had no particular choice. The overhead light in the cell hummed at a frequency that seemed calibrated specifically to prevent sleep, and I lay back on the bench and stared at it, and thought about 8 months. I thought about the first time Ray had trusted me enough to let me ride along for a pickup. I thought about the Thursday 3 months in when I'd sat in a parked car across from a loading dock and watched Harlow walk out with a gym bag that I'd photographed 11 times from 3 different angles. I thought about the 3 men whose names I'd read in the case files: Antonio Reyes, 26, Kevin Park, 31, a man identified only as John Doe, approximate age 19, and the specific way their faces had arranged themselves in my mind on the nights when the work felt too long and too dirty to continue. I thought about all of that, and I did not let myself be afraid. At 2:50 in the morning, the cell door opened. Not a guard, not Pelham, a woman in plain clothes with a visitor badge and the particular walk of someone who owns every room she enters, Lieutenant Chen, moving through a precinct house at 3 in the morning like she'd built it herself. Behind her, carrying a manila folder with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood its contents, was Captain Roy Alderman, Internal Affairs Division, Metro PD. I had never been so glad to see a man I barely knew. They didn't bring me out to an interview room. They brought me to the watch commander's office, which meant someone had already made a phone call above Pelham's pay grade. I sat across a desk that wasn't mine and watched Chen set 2 items on its surface: a printed screenshot from the department's records access log and a photograph I recognized from my own case file, taken at the loading dock, Harlow and the gym bag. My 11 angles collapsed into one clean image. He ran the name, Chen said. It wasn't a question. 40 minutes after Pelham entered it into the system, Alderman confirmed, tapping the access log. Dennis Harlow, badge 774, queried Darius Cole at 12:23 a.m. cross-referenced with 2 associated addresses and 1 vehicle registration. The room was very quiet. I looked at the access log. I looked at the timestamp. I looked at Chen, who was looking at me with an expression that said several things simultaneously, the loudest of which was, "This just became something different." "He knows," I said. "Maybe." Chen folded her hands. "Or he's being cautious, running anyone who gets flagged in a zone he monitors. We don't know yet whether he made the connection. We can't wait to find out." "No," she agreed. "We can't." What happened next was not the plan. The plan had been 3 more weeks. Surveillance, documentation, a coordinated arrest at a time and place we controlled. What happened instead was a compression of 17 days into approximately 6 hours, driven by a racist traffic stop in a parking garage that had cracked open the timeline like an egg. By 4 in the morning, Alderman had 2 additional IA investigators pulling Harlow's access history for the past 90 days. By 5, we knew he had queried 3 other names connected to our network in the past 4 weeks. Names that, in retrospect, had quietly disappeared from Ray's operation one by one, without explanation. Harlow hadn't just been taking money to look away. He'd been using his system access to run interference, to warn, to protect. The gym bag money was the floor of what he'd done. The database queries were the ceiling, and we hadn't seen it until now. I sat in the watch commander's office as dawn began to gray the single high window, drinking terrible precinct coffee, and watching the case I'd spent 8 months building transform into something larger and more precise than I'd imagined it. There was a particular feeling that came with that. Not triumph, not yet, but the cold clarity of a man who has been running toward something in the dark and has just seen, for the first time, exactly what it is. At 6:15, Chen looked at me across the desk. "Can you be ready by 9? "I've been ready since November," I said. She almost smiled. Almost. I went home, showered, and stood in front of my bathroom mirror for a long time. The man looking back at me was not Darius Cole. He was not the careful, contained version of Marcus Webb that spent 8 months disappearing into a role. He was something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. I put on a suit. Not the Accord and Cigarettes cover wardrobe, a real suit, charcoal gray, the one I wore to my detective's commendation ceremony 3 years ago. I knotted the tie slowly, watching my own hands in the mirror until they stopped carrying even a trace of last night's adrenaline. Then I picked up my real badge from the safe where it had been sitting for 8 months, clipped it to my belt, and walked out. The arrest of Dennis Harlow happened at 9:47 in the morning in the 4th District bullpen, in front of 11 officers, 2 civilians, and 1 desk sergeant, who later told a reporter he'd never seen anything like it. Alderman led the team. I walked in beside Chen, badge visible, in the charcoal suit, and I watched Dennis Harlow look up from his computer screen and see me, and I watched the exact moment the architecture of everything he thought he'd managed collapse behind his eyes. It happened in about a second and a half. He looked at Darius Cole's face and saw Marcus Webb's badge, and the math resolved itself instantly and completely, and there was nothing left in his expression after that but a kind of terrible vacancy. "Dennis Harlow," Alderman said, "you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and accessory to the distribution of a controlled substance resulting in death. You have the right to remain silent." Harlow stood slowly. His chair rolled back and hit the partition behind him with a soft plastic knock. He looked at me, not at Alderman, not at Chen, at me specifically, and for a moment I thought he was going to speak. He didn't. He put his hands out. I watched them cuff him with his own department's handcuffs, and I thought about the concrete pillar in the parking garage, and the fluorescent hum of the holding cell, and Antonio Reyes and Kevin Park, and the unnamed 19-year-old, and I said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. The matter of Officer Craig Pelham took slightly longer, and was, in some ways, the more important accounting. His incident report, "Suspicious male attempting to break into a vehicle," was reviewed by the department's Office of Professional Responsibility within 48 hours. The review pulled the parking garage's security footage, which showed, in clear and unambiguous detail, a man standing beside a car, holding a key, attempting to unlock a door, complying with every instruction given to him, and being placed in handcuffs without provocation, probable cause, or any observable violation of law. It showed Pelham's approach. It showed the flashlight. It showed the calculation I had watched run behind his eyes, preserved now in 14-second increments on a server that would not lose it. Pelham was placed on administrative leave pending a full OPR investigation. His attorney released a statement suggesting the incident had been a misunderstanding based on reasonable concern. The garage footage was not interested in the statement. It said what it said. I was asked to provide a formal account. I provided one. I was very specific. I used complete sentences and precise timestamps, and I did not soften a single word, because the words did not need softening. They needed to be exactly what they were, in the record, permanent. The day the OPR findings were released, Pelham's partner Torres called me. I almost didn't pick up. I let it ring to the 4th tone, then answered. "I want you to know," Torres said, and then stopped. There was a long pause, the kind that carries actual weight. I should have said something that night. When he filed the report, I knew it wasn't right. I sat with that for a moment. Lieutenant wound between my ankles, bumping his broad forehead against my ankle. "Why didn't you?" I asked, not with anger, with genuine curiosity. Another pause. "I don't have a good answer for that." "I know," I said. "That's the problem. I didn't hang up cruelly. I just let the conversation find its own end, and when it did, I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood in the quiet of my apartment listening to the morning." Lieutenant jumped onto the counter and sat next to the phone, blinking at me with the profound indifference of a creature who has never once in his life been made to explain himself to anyone. That was 8 months ago now. Harlow pleaded guilty to 3 counts of corruption and 2 counts of obstruction. He is currently serving a 4-year sentence and has permanently forfeited his pension, his badge, and, as a consequence of civil forfeiture proceedings related to the lake house, his lake house, I think sometimes about the gym bag and the careful, practiced way he'd carried it out of that loading dock, and how certain he must have been that he was untouchable. He was wrong about that. Most of them are wrong about that in the end, but they carry their certainty so well you almost believe it yourself. Pelham was terminated from the department following the OPR findings. He is currently appealing. He may win the appeal. The footage will still exist. The incident report will still say what it says. The gap between those two things will still be what it is, and no appeals. Court has jurisdiction over gaps. I put in for active duty reassignment 3 months after that night. I'm back in a real precinct now, with my badge on my belt and my name on my door and coffee that I make myself every morning from whole Guatemalan dark roast beans, the same brand my father taught me. I drive a department-issued sedan, not the Accord, which finally had its driver-side door handle replaced and was decommissioned from the fleet. I was there the day they processed it out. I stood in the motor pool and looked at it for a moment. The cracked dash, the cigarette smell upholstery, the door with its new handle that had never fooled anyone. And I thought about everything that car had carried without complaint. Then I walked to my new car, got in, and drove home. The badge on the passenger seat caught the afternoon light as I pulled out of the lot. 8 months it had sat in a safe. 8 months of Darius coal and burner phones and parking garages in the middle of the night. I picked it up at a red light and held it for a second, feeling its weight, which had not changed at all. It felt exactly like what it was. Mine.